Hey everybody, welcome back to the American Juche Study Group. I'm Noah Shank, and I'm the founder of it. I'm a Korean American and an anti-imperialist activist. And I'm the editor of this new text, Juche for American Workers, Volume 1, which compiles the writings of Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-Il, and will be the text used for our weekly study sessions. The American Juche Study Group is a broad initiative including people of all races, religious backgrounds, and political affiliations who are interested in learning the ideology of the Korean Revolution. We bring with us a spirit of intellectual charity and goodwill toward all humankind. We refuse to accept the hateful caricature of North Korea presented in American media, and instead want to learn the ideas that have held the DPRK together for so long and enabled it to withstand circumstances that would most certainly cause any other government on the planet to fall. We come with open minds and diversity of thought, and we share one goal: peaceful reunification of the Korean Peninsula in the context of a world without war and poverty, in which every nation is enabled to grow and thrive to its fullest potential. We ask, if you are studying with us today, if you could please send a small $5 contribution to support our works, as we need funds to make sure that we can do all of the important work that we do toward peace and development around the world and the United States beyond globalism, imperialism. I'd also like to remind folks, if you're watching, that the study group is open. It's free to join. Anybody can join. The link will be in the chat to be able to join the study session. So this week, we will be actually discussing, this is a favorite essay of mine. It's very deep and very interesting. It's on the problem of conflict in art and literature by Kim Il-sung. And it's a speech given in 1964 to the production team of a drama called Morning Glow. And it's him sort of off the cuff, giving his critique of the play, and then talking sort of about the role that conflict plays in literature and and art, and sort of the role that art and literature play in our lives. And I think that art is a big influence on our daily lives. It's something that a lot of people don't think about, the art that they consume. They just sort of passively watch Netflix, or they play video games or watch anime or whatever, and they don't really think deeply about the politics behind it. How is that art influencing them to feel? And a lot of artists, as such, don't really think so much about the impact that it's going to have on the people that are consuming it, and are more concerned with making the most money from maximizing the amount of people watching. But it's something that I find to be very interesting. I find the field of aesthetics, in philosophy, they call the study of what makes art beautiful and how it is that art should be. They call that field aesthetics, and I find aesthetics to be very, very fascinating. So anyway, I think we can get into our first quote. So it's just from the beginning. He basically says, the drama Morning Glow is very good. Not only its content is good, but the acting is natural and free from awkwardness, and the direction is excellent. This is a good play which will help to educate the working people in communist ideology. It is rich in material suited for communist education. It illustrates very well the most important traits of communists: love for the people, love for children, love for their comrades, and love for their collective. The heroine saves children who are drowning in a freezing river at the risk of her life. This impressive scene moves people profoundly. Characters in this work embody noble communist traits and of appreciating and caring for one another, which mirrors the labor of love and the love of labor and the spirit of looking after and being careful with communal property. I think that's it's a really beautiful point made by Kim Il-sung about the way that it is that a communist should be. There's that famous quote by Che Guevara, which I don't think people often take to heart. A communist is motivated by a great love of the people, a deep and abiding love of the people, and I think a lot of people don't really take it very seriously, at least in the West. For a lot of people in the West, becoming a communist or becoming politically active is an expression of the resentment towards society. It's an expression of their sort of middle-class alienation for the fact that maybe they were bullied in school, or maybe they feel that their parents didn't understand them or whatever. But really, at its heart, why would anybody ever listen to you about how a society should be if you don't care about the outcome of that society, if you don't care about the people inhabiting it? And what great representation of that than your treatment of children. I mean, I don't know if folks have anything to say about that. If not, I guess we can move on to our next quote. Yeah. This drama also deals with the wretchedness of life as it used to be, which helps towards class education, as well as with education in our revolutionary traditions. Further, it shows how necessary it is for everyone to study, the need for launching a mass movement for technical innovations, the challenge to speed up the mechanization of agriculture, and in fact, nearly all of the important problems raised by our party's policy. I think it's really fascinating how this is something that will be used against a country like North Korea. Oh, everything in their country, right, is propaganda, right? But it's like we have propaganda in this country too, and I think that and it does leak into anti-imperialist countries. Like a huge problem with anti-imperialist countries that I think works of art like this can really help to assuage is that as people get older, they don't really remember what life was like before the revolution and the living conditions are, and they don't really remember how it is that breaking free of the Western financial system would have improved their lives, and they sort of cling to this fantasy that somehow if they were to allow the IMF and the World Bank to come in and just loot their country, that they would be better off, and the opposite is the case. Actually, I think it's really, really important that it be made clear, and that's also another thing is you'll often hear, oh, well, if you if you think socialism is so great, why don't you live in a socialist country? It's like, well, why are you judging the socialist country against the most wealthy country in the history of the planet and not against how was it that country was beforehand? How was it that Korea was when it was held in poverty by the Japanese imperialists, when they outlawed Christianity, when, the average person was illiterate, when, millions of people starved every year? How was it in China, when, your average person never saw a doctor in their entire life, where you had generations of children who had never seen the sun in their entire life because they would go down, to mine in caves all day and then come out of the cave when it was already dark outside. They spent their entire childhood having never seen the sun. I mean, and to compare that to the way that China is today, I mean, it's incomparable. And so for people to sit there, I think it's just incredibly arrogant and act like, oh, well, they're not as wealthy as a capitalist country, specifically an imperialist country in the West, which is doing everything in its power to keep them poor. I mean, it's beyond ridiculous. Tim, it looked like, or Caleb, yeah.
Oh, well, I guess Tim can go first if he wants.
Oh, no comment. Go ahead, Caleb.
Oh, what you said there, Noah, reminded me of, for a while, there was an anti-Cuba website. It was called therealcuba.com or something like that. And one of the things it had a picture of a refrigerator, and it looked kind of beat up or, messed up. And it's like, this is the refrigerator that every Cuban family has. And I saw that and I'm just like, wow, how many people like living in Africa would love to have a refrigerator? How many people living in Peru in the jungles don't have any refrigerator, and it's like, oh, look, this refrigerator is not as nice as like an American fancy refrigerator. So therefore Cuba sucks. It's just like, it's such a shallow line of argument.
I just want to add, working with the Census Bureau, not every American even has a refrigerator. So, I mean, even in one of the quote wealthiest nations, there are people who do not have a refrigerator.
Wow.
Yeah.
There you go.
I think it's something like almost 20%.
Wow.
A lot of their dismissals of Cuba are in of themselves projection.
Yeah, and it's it's a common argument. It's like, well, poverty exists in X, Y, and Z countries. So I'm reminded, I've heard stories. There's a common thing that people will do when they're like trying to talk about an anti-imperialist country is they'll describe something that's very normal in a way that makes it sound like it's insidious. Like I remember, like an uncle was telling me, like, oh, how can I support countries like, you know, Russia or like the former Soviet Union or something like that. And he, you know, he had a girlfriend one time that was from like Belarus or something. And he told me the story. He was like, oh, it was horrible. You know, she was a very high achieving young person in middle school. And so the Soviet Union, they took her from her little town and they took her and they put her on a train. She rode 4 hours on a train to Moscow where she could train at the best technical school in the country. And she only saw her family during holidays. And it's like, we have those in this country. They're called boarding schools. And don't you think it's really good that, you know, somebody who's high achieving, you know, was given, who came from a came from a poor family, was given the opportunity to go and get a higher education, you know, in the capital. And then he was like, oh, and then they wanted her to study farming techniques. So they sent her to a little town in Iowa where there was like no people and everybody there spoke Russian. It was just evil. Like, it's just like, oh, it's so awful, you know.
There you
Um, I just wanted to say something about propaganda. Like you said, we see propaganda all the time. I mean, the one I love is how you cannot even like watch a film from the Soviet Union or Russia. They always have to bring in, even in the reviews, I don't care where it is, it's always something about, oh, and the horrible, purges of Stalin and the evils of communism. Well, hey, why don't we hear British movies? Why don't they start, reviews about, and, the UK, the most barbarous country in the world, with Winston Churchill, the most barbaric leader ever, who murdered 2 million Kikuis in Kenya, murdered over 2 million Bengalis. But we don't hear all of this, right? So the propaganda is always how wonderful a mass murderer like Winston Churchill is. By the way, speaking about Winston Churchill, dropped napalm in Greece, right? But no, we don't hear about those stories. They don't start that way. And even I wanted to speak about film. I was just thinking about It's a Wonderful Life. I think that movie was made in the 40s, and it has the evil Mr. Potter. Well, if you can buy a VHS copy of that, you should, because they're changing the DVD version. And some versions have already been changed. You see, It's a Wonderful Life actually was almost going to be red baited under UAC, the House on American Activities, because they said the film was anti-capitalist. It shows the banker in an evil light, and we cannot have bankers in an evil light. And but yes, so they removed a lot of the Mr. Potter scenes. So and also the scene of the woman who becomes a prostitute because she cannot find a job and because she's poor. So those scenes have been removed. So anyway, so yeah, we have propaganda in this country. It's just people are so used to it, they don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, American propaganda is the most sophisticated propaganda in the world because nobody knows that it's propaganda. You know, they just, the amount of times I've had a conversation with somebody, and they'll unironically say something to me, but like, isn't that what like the bad guy in this movie thinks? It's like, yeah, I guess it is. I mean, that's an argument,
No, that's an old Soviet joke I heard. And it's like there's two people on a plane next to each other, a Russian and an American. And the Russian and the American are talking, and the Russian says, my job is to study propaganda, and the American says, oh, wow, you guys have really good propaganda in Russia. You must have a lot to study. He says, well, our propaganda is nowhere near as good as your propaganda in America is. And the American says, but we don't have any propaganda. And the Russian says, exactly.
Yeah. I mean, it's just the U.S. military just so happens to fund all of the major action movies, get like subsidized. The MCU is basically advertising for the U.S. military, and it's a coincidence. It's just a
Also
coincidence.
coincidence that the U.S. Military DoD pays for the creation of video games, and
Yeah,
also
Call of Duty.
Pornhub. Pornhub is a DoD financed company. Yeah.
Well, tell us more about that, Jessica, if you have info on that.
It's quite simple. I mean, the U.S. military, what do? When they go into countries? They don't just attack soldiers. We don't have wars with soldiers anymore. Since World War One, we have wars where we attack populations. And so you terrorize people by raping and killing women and children. Well, the whole purpose of Pornhub was to desensitize men so that they would rape and murder and kill women and children. Why do you think it's so sadistic? And there's just all the child pornography, and a lot of that is very violent.
Yeah, I heard when
really little
Israel
girls. Yeah.
when Israel invaded Lebanon in 2006, they hacked the airwaves and they put porn on all the televisions. Have you heard of this? It was kind of a famous incident. Yeah, and it was like part of the invasion was that they thought like, oh, all the people would be distracted by porn on television and they wouldn't go out and fight them. And that was part of the 2006 war. And I've read a lot about that, and that's very, very fascinating. So it shows about pornography as a psychological weapon, as a military, serving a military purpose. So.
Yeah, two things that reminds me of. First of all, like anytime the U.S. enters a new country or a new country is under attack, the top trending search on Pornhub, like they release statistical data, and it will be person of that country.
Ooh.
Gets blah blah blah. Yeah,
That's
weird.
Dark. That's really dark.
Like when the special military operation started, the two trending searches were Ukrainian and Russian, and similar with like Palestine and Israel. When it's very
Total
strange,
coincidence.
Totally coincidental. And then the other thing is that, I forgot the other thing I was going to say. It is very dark. The other thing is that I don't know if you guys remember, is bringing it back to Korea, but like that's like a very common like weird Orientalist attack that they do on like people from Asian countries, is that they must be just like so sex obsessed that as soon as they're exposed to pornography, they won't be able to help themselves. Like, when the Koreans were helping to fight the Kursk incursion, there was all of these articles in mainstream US media claiming that all of the North Korean soldiers, it was their first time being exposed to pornography and they were all addicted with no evidence whatsoever. Like, where would you even get a claim like that? Like, how would you verify something like that?
Yeah.
I mean, there was sorry, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
Quickly. Well, there was a recent Facebook video just last year that was posted. I think it was last year, and it was in the Capitol. And they had a big screen, and they were watching. They were showing K-pop, and people came and started protesting. They thought it was very sexist, very misogynist, completely inappropriate to be shown. So I mean, it's just that we've normalized pornography, so that people think that it's exciting to see pornography. But in a country like North Korea, evidently, I mean, they thought K-pop was pornography, imagine, and they were protesting that.
Well, regarding going back to Korea, I've noticed that when it comes to mythology or misconceptions about the country, they're in an earlier stage than Cuba or China or the Soviet Union was, where people now for Cuba have a better understanding of the facts about it, whereas I think the average American or many people I talk to still believe ridiculous lies like Yeonmi Park claiming that they push trains, which is obviously not true, or everyone has the same haircut, another not true. And I maybe things are getting better, but I feel like the DPRK is the last refuge of these ridiculous falsehoods.
Yeah, I think a big part of that is you can't go there, that they've made it illegal to go there. And as well, it's just, I mean, it's like funny, and like nobody will, and if you say anything, oh, well, are you defending North Korea? It's just so evil. It's like, but you can't verify any of the claims that you've made about it.
Yeah.
Everybody, oh, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Well, Dr. Bruce Cummings is considered the top scholar of Korean history in America. And he is somewhat sympathetic to North Korea. He's not a communist. And he actually says he doesn't consider North Korea to be a communist country. He considers it to be like a corporate state. And he's written some other stuff. But he's written a couple books, Korea's Place in the Sun, North Korea, Another Country. And I remember when he spoke at my college, he said in his speech he frequently gets phone calls from ABC, NBC, etc. And wanting him to confirm that like they claim Kim Jong-Un invented the hamburger, or or hit a hole in one the first time he played golf and all of that. And he says, how would I confirm that? Like what's that? And he won't confirm it because he says there's no factual basis for this. And then he always says, what's your source on it? And they say, oh, it was somebody in the South Korean military who told us this. And it's like, oh, well, but then it gets repeated in mainstream media in America as if it's just true. And like, there's a couple stories that I've seen, like one story that they ran in the New York Daily News. The headline was North Korea believes in unicorns. And it was like, haha, they believe in unicorns. They're so silly or whatever. And if you actually read the story, what it is they dug up an archaeological site and they translated the writing on the site. And it just said tomb of a unicorn. And it was just some ancient site that referenced that. That's all it was. Like, it doesn't say they believe in unicorns, just stuff like that, where it's like they look for any like story they can stretch to make some kind of tabloid mockery of North Korea. And it is racist. They wouldn't do this to a white country. And it's odd, and they would probably do it to China if they could get away with it. But there's just so much Chinese business back and forth with America. They probably can't get away with it with China. But there is a racial element to it because it's just bizarre. Kind of like the Team America movie, or when they made that film about killing the leader of North Korea. You remember that? It's
they
like
always do like really racist like impersonations of Kim Jong-Un, and at SNL they couldn't even get an Asian guy to. They had Fred Armisen do it, and he's Italian. Like they have him play all the dictators. He's Italian. Like they have him do Kim Jong-Un. They had him doing Hugo Chavez when Chavez was still alive. It's like the guy's like he's not even a person of color. He doesn't even look that ethnically. He's Italian. Like anyway.
Yeah.
But I think we should move on to the next quote.
Okay.
The party cell chairman is well drawn. He's the ideal type of cell chairman ever described in literature. The cell chairman loves people deeply and educates them by setting a good example. This is a good representation of a typical party worker who is simple, gentle, highly principled, and yet broad-minded. Only when workers of our motherly party are possessed of such virtues will people come into its magnanimous embrace. Party workers should not be in the habit of using sharp words in order to show their allegiance to party principle, but neither should they be weak because they have to be generous. I think what's really coming across here, well, first of all, I'd like to talk a little bit about cell structure, because he says, a cell chairman, and a lot of people, especially if you're from a Western country, you may not be familiar with cell structure, what a cell is. In a lot of American communist groups, it's they tend to be Trotskyite oriented, and they'll have a branch, right? And everybody from that area is in a branch. But in the old CPs, they used to have cell structures where you would have small cells of 3 to 5 people, and you would have a head of that cell who was responsible for all of the people in that group. And that's a much more working class way of organizing people. It's if CPI ever grows to be, large enough to need a cell structure, it's a very efficient way of organizing a group of people, where everybody is accountable to one person and everybody knows who they're accountable for. And it sort of layers up like a beehive. I know Caleb has talked about this in the past.
Yeah. Cell structure, it's more of a military way of doing things. And this is the kind of thing, there's the J. Peters manual, the manual on organization written by J. Peters that the Communist Party used in the 1930s that lays out cell structure. And I think still to this day, CPUSA does have something like that. They just call it clubs because clubs doesn't sound as scary as cells. But yeah, the idea is that if you ever have more than 5 members in a certain area, then it divides into 2. Right. And that there's like a state organizer who they all report to, the leader of every club. And there's a national, and it's like it. Yeah. And also the resistance, the armed resistance groups in Korea and Vietnam and places like that were organized with these ways of doing things. And it's just a very effective like military mechanism, like cell autonomy, like, that basically every group of 5 was able to fight on its own, even if it lost contact with the center, kind of. That was very effective in Vietnam. As long as you had 5 soldiers, you could keep fighting, kind of. So.
Yeah, but I have noticed, like in contrast, there are like a lot of groups in America. They'll be oriented into. It's not cells like their branches. There's a local branch, and like nobody's ever accountable to anybody else. And there's 8 million people, and you never really know who's really part of the group and who's not. And there's a bunch of people who are floating around. And I've noticed that it becomes very quickly ineffective for doing anything other than like maybe having a weekly meeting that like, and people don't show up for things because, there's nobody to hold them accountable. There's nobody they feel they're accountable to unless you get to a certain level within the organization,
Yeah. Yeah. Another thing that I will say about leftist groups that I became very aware of, when I moved to New York City, I was working 40 hours a week. And I would then come to a party meeting every Monday night. We had our local coordinating committee meeting. And then the next day I had to be up by 7:30 to be at the office by 9 the next day. And so, for me, when I would show up at this Monday night meeting, and it was all these retired folks and all these student activists, and the meeting was supposed to start at 7, and we'd be lucky if the meeting started at 8, and we'd be lucky if the meeting ended by 10. That was my time, and that if you're a college student, you're just kind of hanging out. Oh, you've got a lot of time. If you're retired, you're just kind of hanging out. But if you're a working person working 40 hours a week, that's your time they're cutting into. And that was one thing I noticed about activist spaces. There was always this kind of like, well, let's start an hour after we say we're going to start. And, we start an hour late. And then right before it's time to start, then everyone, they say, oh, we all need to have a cigarette break right before it's time to start. So then everyone has to go out and smoke. And it's just very, very unprofessional. Right. And working people's time is money. I mean, you only have so much free time, and it's very different from being a student and just kind of hanging out,
Yeah, and I feel like petty bourgeois elements in general are just like very disrespectful of other people's time. I think about like if you ever have a health issue, like doctors will not understand that you have a job. They'll, it's like, oh, come in at this time, and then they change your appointment 4 times, and then, you have to take all this time off work. And then, then we have to reapprove you to go back to work. But, you don't want to go back to work, do you? It's like, well, actually, I have like bills to pay. And like, if I miss rent, like I'm going to be homeless. So I would like to go back to work, please. Could you please sign the thing? Oh, I just don't feel, maybe next week, come in an appointment at another time. And it'll be at like 2 p.m. And don't work past 3. It's a thing of like, once you make it to be like a petty bourgeois element where you're, you sort of become, I don't know, less respectful of other people's time.
Well, my question though is how does this change in a gig economy? Because a lot of what we're describing here is working class culture in relation to being a wage worker. Now in the gig economy, your time is still money, but you're your own boss, right? And it's like Uber drivers have to drive at certain times and all that. So I'd be curious how the gig economy kind of changes that.
Yeah, I mean, I've noticed that that's a frustrating thing about people who work wage jobs, do not understand about the gig economy is that, well, yeah, you're your own boss and you make your own hours, but not really. You're basically proletarian, and that there are certain hours where you have to work or you will not make any money that day. But a lot of people will be like, oh, well, like you don't, you're working a gig job, just like, could you do this and this and that for me? It's like, no, I can't. Like, if you're delivering food, you're only going to make money between like 12 and 3 and then between like 5 and midnight, but there are a lot of people who it's just like, oh, well, like you make your own hours, right? No, you don't actually, and
No,
that's a
but
very
it's even
common thing.
worse.
Like a with, yeah.
But it's even worse because you're always stressed out about money. So even when you're not working, all you can think of is money. Where,
Mhm.
I need to look for another job. I need to find something else to do. So I mean, you don't have any free time if all you're doing is being so stressed out and looking for better employment. So the gig economy, you're not really your own boss. I mean, like Caleb said, I mean, you're basically just a wage slave, just in another form, actually in a worse form.
Yeah, it's like peace wages, they used to call them, and they abolished peace wages. That was a big part of the early labor movement. That if you worked at a factory or you worked at a restaurant or something like that, that they would only pay you, for what you produce or for the amount of customers that came in or for what that company was selling. And they've abolished those because it's a way that the employer is trying to pass on the risk onto their employees. was, well, we've brought those back. It's called the gig economy. And another thing is that common thing, the DSA people, they love to demand, worker stock. They think that socialism means like a worker stock ownership program where the means of production is shared. And that means that, everybody will have an equal share in that company. Well, what that really is it's passing off the risk that the employer is supposed to take on. The reason that they're allegedly making all this money is that they're supposed to be taking on all this risk, right? If the company goes under, well, I could just find another job, and if the company is not making a lot of money, well, you still have to pay me. Well, if everybody owns the company, well, then that's my problem too. That's effectively, it's a piece wage. It's a step backwards.
Yeah, I actually see a parallel between this kind of worker cooperative obsession that DSA and some of the social democrats have, and Mussolini's corporatism, or the national syndicalism of fascism in Spain. Because, essentially, what they want, they don't actually want a planned economy or an economy that works for public good. They just want every employee to be, being a stock, holder or something like that. And that's kind of on paper, that's kind of what Mussolini did in Italy, right? Whereas every company was a corporate, but it was the employees sort of owned it, but not really. And, a lot of these worker cooperative obsession stuff, that was a big part of the Bread Tube book that I wrote, is that, this worker cooperative obsession, first of all, it's you shouldn't support any real socialist country because clearly it's not a worker cooperative. And second, it's you're keeping profits in command. You're not calling for centralizing the means of production. And it's very sinister, and it's very degrowth oriented. Ultimately, that's kind of what it is it's degrowth. They want everyone to have less, and they want, less, So, the idea is, I guess, Amazon will take over the whole world and have a monopoly, but everyone who works at Amazon will own Amazon, because they get a stock share, after their day working in the warehouse. It sounds like a really ruthless, awful form of monopolistic capitalism facilitated by the state. It's fascism.
Just a quick note. Quick note. American Airlines is a perfect example. So in 2003, they were going to go under, and they allowed the workers to buy in, right? And so then what happened was the workers, the other airlines began to undercut because they knew they can do it. They said to themselves, hey, we'll just undercut. And this meant that the workers had to work more hours. And because you own part of the stock and you didn't want it to go bankrupt, so you had a situation where people were working all of this overtime that they normally would not have. At the end of the day, American Airlines went under because the workers, they were so exploited. It was just, it could not go forward, that level of exploitation. And in Mondragon is the very famous worker cooperatives, right? In Spain. And look what's happened. So originally it was, the workers did own the shares, and they also worked in the factories. And now you have a situation where the owners are now hiring other people. So, particularly illegals, right? Right. So, it's incredible. And in Argentina, it didn't work. You had window companies that were competing against each other, these worker cooperatives. So, yes, this doesn't work. You need to have a planned economy.
Well, in fairness to co-ops,
Yeah,
I think worker co-ops do work well in socialist countries. I've heard from a commentator that there's a lot of them in Vietnam. I know there for a fact there's historically some in Soviet Union, and pretty much every socialist country has lots and lots of them. I think that it offers a better way to make sure they're not hyper competitive, because in co-ops that I've seen, the people that run them are very well meaning, but in practice it ends up with a lot of bitterness and confusion of whether or not it's going to be a nonprofit and whether they can afford to pay workers at all. And then someone gets a job and then someone else doesn't, and it's not fair. And it's just based on connections and the ability to, just be political. And that's just, it doesn't work for most people.
Yeah, in the context of a socialist planned economy, it works just fine, And in fact, the collective farms in the Soviet Union were kind of cooperatives, and that the state purchased the agriculture at a fixed rate. They had state farms in the Soviet Union as well, but they were not dominant. It was mainly collective farms, and they got paid for how much they produced at a set rate from the state. And that's kind of the model of really existing socialism. Agriculture is largely cooperative in the collective farms. And I think in Yugoslavia under Tito, every factory was like that. Every factory got paid for how much they produced, and the state purchased the items at a set rate.
Yeah, many people argue that greatly contributed to the collapse of Yugoslavia. They argue that, because everything was, all of the factories were like that they competed in odd ways, and that, the incentive structure was broken in such a way that, products in Yugoslavia were not being produced in the ways that they should have been. But if you point that out to somebody who is a worker cooperative enjoyer, then they will say, oh, well, it doesn't count because he was a dictator or something. So anyway, next quote. Conflicts and literature and art. So we're going to go through a couple of them because I think, they're going to build off of each other. So conflict in literature and art varies with the character of the social relationships, which are expressed through conflict. In capitalist society, the differences between the exploiting and the exploited classes are antagonistic and irreconcilable, and therefore the conflict in an artwork which mirrors such social relations cannot but portray this antagonism. Next quote, please. And this next quote is, I believe, I read that one, and then next slide after that. So this next quote is from, it's not from Kim Il-sung, it's from Karl Marx. This is from the Communist Manifesto, which is a very basic thing, but it's actually making a very interesting point that I don't think gets made often enough. He's talking about bourgeois revolutions here. He says, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation, anguish distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast frozen relations with their train of ancient and vulnerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air. All that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. So the point that Kim Il-sung is making, and is he's in a very simple way. I think this is a very brilliant thing that Kim Il-sung is doing. In a very simple way, he's making a very brilliant point that is made by Karl Marx and that is often forgotten by the left, by the Western left. In a lot of Western leftists, a lot of leftist discourse, it's a lot about conflict. It's about turning over old things, right? Abolish this, abolish billionaires, abolish everything that makes me upset, abolish good things, abolish bad things. Well, the point is that actually that is the bourgeois way of doing things. That because the bourgeoisie are a class that is constantly in a state of attempting to revolutionize the force of production and are constantly competing with each other and have this natural antagonism, with working people, and are constantly trying to hold on to this, that they're constantly in a state of trying to sweep away the old ways of doing things, that they are destroying things. This is what, right, in Hegel and the dialectic, right, you have the original, you have the negation, and then you have the negation of the negation, right? And that the capitalist society was constantly focused on negating the old ways of doing things. During the French Revolution, they cut off all the heads of all the old monarchs and they abolished religion, right? Karl Marx would often make fun of the anarchists and the people who were inspired by the French Revolution. He would say, oh, it's not enough for them to be atheists. They won't stop until they've abolished God himself. It's that they're constantly transgressing against the old ways of doing things and trying to sweep them away. And that's actually what Hegel would call a bad infinity, in that you have infinity, but infinity can only be related to in relation to finitude, right? We only know of infinity as a negation of what is finite, of numbers. Say you're counting on a number line, right? That's one way of looking at infinity. You're counting on a number line, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and it never ends. That's one way of looking at infinity. But Hegel said, no, there's another way of looking at infinity, and that infinity is the development of being itself. If you take a number, if you take a fraction, right? If you take 3/7 and you express it as a decimal point, right? that will also give you another form of infinity, an irrational number, right? That will go onwards towards infinity, and that the exactness through which you are beginning to understand that is another way of infinity. And that the bourgeois way of looking things is that bad infinity. It's saying, well, all of the old things are just going to go away. That's why in the U.S. Constitution, all of the rights we have, they're negative rights. All of the rights in our Constitution are things that the government is not allowed to do. But notice the rights are never that you have a right to a job. It's never that you have a right to a certain standard of living. You have a right. It's that the government is not allowed to stop you from doing this. The government is not allowed to stop you from doing that. Right? They can only think of the world in relation to, we don't want to do the things that the bad things are doing. But socialism is actually about positive liberty, right? It's about giving expression to reality itself. And then Kim Il-sung has another quote about this on the next slide. The conflict in works of literature dealing with socialist reality should not be antagonistic. It should not be an irreconcilable conflict between enemies, but a conflict between the advanced and the backward, between the old and the new, in the course of developing towards communism. In other words, he's saying that the central conflict of socialism, of art that is portraying a socialist society, is the conflict of how can we come together as one people and make a better world, because that is a true infinity. It's an infinity that is given expression to the nature of reality, of our understanding of reality, that human beings are so special and that we are constantly finding new ways to master our environment, constantly finding new ways to understand what is around us. And that is truly what socialist consciousness and socialist art is about, rather than trying to just do away with the old system. I think of the RCP on Caleb's stream last night. They were talking about how, the old way of doing the criminal justice system, it sucks, right? And when under communism, it won't be like that. Well, that's not really a socialist way of doing things, is it? That's a very capitalist way of doing things, right? Things suck and it's going to be different. Well, that's not really saying anything, is it? That's not really saying anything about how people are going to relate to each other. That's not really saying anything about, the culture that will be preserved, etc. And in some ways, you could argue this is a little bit of a conservative way of doing things. It reminds me a little bit of what our unificationist friends would say about communism, right? That's actually what Marx was saying about capitalism. Maybe folks have commentary on this. Oh, you're muted, but
I mean, I guess that
I actually will relate to another communist group, the Party for Socialism and Liberation. They put out like their manifesto of like what socialism will be like in America. And it was just, it was just nauseating. I couldn't even make myself read it because it was like I could tell that every section had been written. Every section was written by somebody, and you could tell that there had been a big fight over who had the right to write it in terms of identity politics. It was just puke. But, and it was just, and they're just getting every niche, liberal cause. But one of the things that I thought was amusing was that if you read their manifesto, it was like after the revolution, they're going to have a magic wand and they're just going to go around making things disappear. Bing, bing.
Yeah,
It's like, and like, one of the things they said is we will abolish landlordism. And I thought, what does that mean? Does that mean everyone owns their home? Does that mean, like, how do you abolish landlordism? I mean, you have to explain that. But no, they're just going to abolish it. Bing, and it's going to go away. And they're going to abolish racism. Bing, they're going to abolish sexism. Bing, they're going to abolish, bullying. Bing, I mean, it's just like everything bad. We're just going to make it disappear. And it's just such a childish, like, way of doing things. And it's like, and again, it's like when you're listing things off, it's almost like everything in their book, it lacked any vision or passion. It was all just like, we're checking off the boxes. We're, making every little activist leftist group happy. And we're saying, every, it just, we got, we got LGBTQRCSZY. I mean, it's just, that's what it read like. Go ahead.
Yeah, it seems like it's weird because I've noticed in recent years there's been like a lot of weird overtures made by modern communist groups to anarchists. Like they really focus on trying to recruit anarchists. I don't know why that is.
It's trendy and it sounds smart and edgy to call yourself an anarchist. So like a lot of liberals just call themselves anarchists. That's like
Bosh.
they couldn't even name like a single famous anarchist, or anything that they thought. It's just like, oh, like there was that joke, a lot of the DSA people were going around calling themselves anarcho-Bidenists. Like, what does that mean? I don't know. I just like, but yeah, I mean, a lot of the leftist groups, a lot of them are captured by liberalism, and the liberal way of doing things is, I'm going to abolish all the bad things I don't like. Right.
Yeah. Well, Noam Chomsky, he's always been a social democrat and a pro-imperialist social democrat. And Jessica has told us the stories about him. But he started in the 80s saying, well, I'm actually an anarchist. And if you looked at Noam Chomsky, he was a social democrat. What he advocated was voting for the Democratic Party. He worked with the labor bureaucracy. He was a member of DSA. But it was like, well, he's an anarchist because in the future, he wants to create some kind of egalitarian, blah, 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 blah. He can talk this radical game or whatever. And then I noticed, especially during Occupy Wall Street, that is the mask that a lot of social democrats now wear. Is they're not social democrats. No. They're anarchists. They're super, super duper radical. And that, a lot of the people who work at the like liberal NGOs, they work for the Democrats, they work for George Soros, but then they're anarchists. If you talk to them, no, they're totally anarchist. It's kind of lost any meaning. There was a real, current of Marxism you could call syndicalism, of people who didn't want to sign contracts with their employers, wanted like the labor unions to rule. There was like an anarchist current like the IWW. That's dead. Anarchism is now just this mask that social democrats wear to say they're ultra radical. There are a few like ideological anarchists out there still, but for the most part, most so-called anarchists are just social democrats.
I have a great story about this after, if you know. Okay. So when I was in college, right, I was, my girlfriend at the time brought me to this party, and she was like, "Oh, you have to talk to this guy. He's so radical, and you'll get along because you have your radical politics, right?" So I'm talking to this guy, and he's calling himself an anarchist, right? And he's like, "Oh, I'm an anarcho-communist, blah 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 blah." I was like, "Oh, okay." So I start talking to him. He's like, "Well, he didn't support any of the anti-imperialist countries, I even mentioned, oh, I'm a big fan of social realism. I really like this statue in Senegal built by the North Koreans." And he was just like, oh, he like turned his nose up. He was all upset. So anyway, I'm talking to him, and he's talking about how he's an anarchist. He's so radical. And I ask him, what do you do for work? He says, "Oh, well, right now I'm a student mostly, but I'm interning with it's not Radio Free Asia. It's the other CIA one. What's the other CIA one?
Radio Free Europe.
No, it's the one that they broadcast. Voice of America. Oh, I work for Voice of America. Like, oh yeah, that's so radical. Like you're a radical communist anarchist, and you literally work for the CIA's radio station. Man, they must have really had a recruiting problem over there. I mean, you must have been practicing tequila very well. He was practicing tequila, and he got in there and he snuck in his radical politics into the CIA radio station. So.
What's a tequila? What's a tequila?
It's an Islamic principle of not discussing something under oppression, usually historically religious oppression from different sects.
That's not exactly. So that's what kind of people that are anti-Islamic, when they don't, when Muslims come out and say, well, we don't believe in violence, they say, well, they're just practicing taqiyya. But what taqiyya actually is in Shia Islam in particular, there were times where it was illegal to be a Shia. And so Shia would operate secretly and hide their faith, and actually, I believe the word assassin comes from Shia, right? They would like infiltrate things and assassinate people and stuff like that. And it was just, Shia Muslims would pretend not to be Shia Muslims in order to get into places and to maneuver and stuff like that. That's my understanding of what it was. And that I guess, in Christianity, there's this belief that you should always, there was that whole thing about, there's this big book that was really popular when I was in high school among evangelicals called She Said Yes, about this girl who was killed in Columbine, who supposedly they pointed the gun at her and said, "Do you believe in Jesus?" And she said yes, and they killed her. That didn't actually happen according to like audio recordings and stuff. But regardless, there's this whole principle in Christianity that like you always say what you believe. You never deny the faith. Whereas the feeling is in Shia Islam in particular, there's a feeling that strategically you might deny the faith in order to advance the cause in the long term or something like that. But then people that don't like Muslims have turned that into would just never believe anything any Muslim says because they're just trying to trick you, which is not what that is.
It's a good thing Jordan Peterson didn't get, wasn't there.
Yeah.
Do you believe in God? Well, it depends on what you mean by God. I mean, technically, if you mean in the sense of a higher being, I guess you could say we might consider myself to be a believer in something like that, but they would just get bored and walk away, I feel. But I think I'd like to let's get back to the text a little bit. I mean, I think something that's really interesting about this is that this is a speech given in 1964. So this would have been around the time that the Cultural Revolution is starting up, and in some ways, it's a repudiation of a lot of the way that that the Cultural Revolution was being enacted at the time in China. He talks about how there are certain plays where they make it seem like the local party bosses are oppressing people, and that there's a rise up to them, and they're portrayed negatively, and that's no good. We should be portraying the party bosses in a positive light because really they really care about people, and we should really be finding ways to make sure that they're acting in ways that are to the benefit of people, right? He talks about the ideal way that a cell person is that they're like a parent, right? That people look up to. He describes the party as motherly. Right, it's a very Freudian way of organizing people and trying to get them to move towards their common good. And it's interesting because Korea was neutral during the Sino-Soviet split, and they would go this way and that way. But I think part of the brilliance of Kim Il-sung is that I think he saw past what was really, in some ways, many people would argue, like the overthrow of the Communist Party in China, and he didn't want something like that to happen in Korea.
I think, didn't North Korea maintain good relations with China even into the Deng Xiaoping era, even to today?
Yeah, there were times where North Korea was seen as being in the Soviet camp. There were times that North Korea was being seen as being in the Chinese camp, and they never burned their bridges with either, which I think was a very, very effective thing on their part.
I think Romania was also like that.
Yeah, well, most of the communist countries sided with the Soviet Union, but still maintained a friendship with China, right? Like North Korea and Cuba. It was only in like the late 70s when China was playing a blatantly pro-US side that Cuba like explicitly called out China during the Gang of 4 Years and things like that. But at one point, China did, during the Gang of 4 Years, they did have demonstrations against North Korea at the border where they burned Kim Il-sung in effigy and such. But then they repudiated that. And, in the final years of Mao's life, there's, he had a face-to-face meeting with Kim Il-sung. And so I might be able to put video on that, of that on if we have time, actually.
Yeah, I think
we're getting towards the end.
North Korea, I think there were also times in the 90s where North Korea did not have good relations with China because China was in some ways being seen as was like moving towards South Korea and whatnot. Like I think like the 2008 Olympics, I think North Korea was the only country at the Olympic committee that did not want China to host the Olympics, because I think that was the year the Chinese government set up diplomatic relations with South Korea.
Okay, yeah. So also there was, we could only speculate, but there was like right before the rise of Xi Jinping, there was some kind of like hardliner conference of Chinese communists in North Korea. And it seems like the rise of Xi Jinping was a pivot towards North Korea and China being more friendly. But it seemed like there was some kind of opposition conference. The previous leader, Hu Jintao was the previous leader before Xi Jinping. Hu Jintao
before him.
Yeah, was viewed by a lot of communists around the world as being kind of a capitalist rotor and such. And the rise of Xi Jinping was seen as a good thing. And now, Xi Jinping was just in North Korea. and got an amazing reception. And I mean that
Yeah,
North Korea and China couldn't be closer. So
I wanted to ask how China was viewed in the 90s and 2000s by the international left, because I found some videos from way back when, Chris Hedges' channel, and they did not like Xi Jinping when he first started out, like at all.
I'm
They
sure
did
they still
not
do.
like it.
yeah, I that's one thing I've noticed, that like, in the 90s and 2000s, it was generally, you had like the Communist Party would kind of softly defend China in some of their writing, but not very loudly. Workers' World, and what eventually became PSL, their line was generally like, well, China hasn't had a full counter revolution, but they've lost their way. It was kind of that. And that was it. And then generally everybody else just dismissed China as, oh, it's just a big giant sweatshop and all of that. It just shows how out of touch the left really is. They had no idea what was going on.
Yeah, I think the earliest I could find of there being like a resurgence in pro-China left-wing stuff, it's interesting. This would go back to like the late first Trump administration, then like 2018. Like this is when we get all the old PSL adjacent media networks coming out just defending China, having all these articles debunking the Uyghur genocide and whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, during the China Olympics, I was in Workers' World and we defended China around the Olympics, but it was very few people, and that it seemed like, yeah, there wasn't much political defense of China during those days. It was just kind of in the Free Tibet thing. They used that against China. China was somehow responsible for, it was like
they tried to frame China for the freaking Darfur thing, which was like, how?
Yeah,
because they bought oil from them or something. Yeah, it's really dumb. But yeah, I mean, speaking of the Olympics, I mean, the DPRK too has had a storied history with the Olympics. Sometimes they're allowed to compete, sometimes they're not. I mean, the North Korean weightlifting team is actually one of the best teams in the world. And similar to China, they're just like frequently barred from competing. They weren't allowed to compete at this last Olympics. The Olympics previous to that, they were allowed to compete jointly with South Korea, and that was a big deal. But at the 2024 games, they were just barred from entering the country, which is a shame because the North Korean weightlifting team like breaks world records every year. They're some of the best in the world. They're shrouded in mystery. Nobody knows, how it is that they're so good. And you had a similar thing. There's Lu Xiaojun, who's one of the best weightlifters in the world in the 98 kilogram weight class. He's a Chinese weightlifter. And they failed him on a drug test. And if you look at, it's like, this is not a drug that a weightlifter would take. It's a drug that like, it's the same drug that Lance Armstrong got caught taking. It makes your like cardiovascular endurance better. It's like, in what way would that help you in weightlifting? It's the opposite response that your body uses, right? It's anaerobic versus aerobic exercise.
Yeah,
they use that to make it.
Yeah. Noah, I was wondering if you knew anything about the old accusations about Russian doping. Like they'll basically say that Russian Olympic skaters dope, and it's like, why would a figure skater dope? Why would a figure skater dope?
Actually, doping is very, very common at the Olympics for every country. It's just that it only matters when the anti-imperialist countries are doing it, and they've done it since the 80s. It's been a huge thing that they use against anti-imperialist countries. Even though, if you look at the history of the creation of steroids and the creation of performance-enhancing drugs, it was the first country to synthesize an anabolic drug that was used exclusively for sporting. It was the United States in the 1950s. It was Dianabol. That's what launched the golden era of bodybuilding with Arnold Schwarzenegger and all that. But in spite of that, in the 80s, that was a big reason why they said that they had to boycott the Soviet Olympics when the Soviet Union hosted them. And then in 2014 with the Sochi Games, I mean, what the Russians are accused of doing, it's like doping protocols from like the 90s that like any serious athletics board would not try and do, because like the risk of getting caught is just so ridiculous. I mean, people will find ways to cheat, and in any system where there's an incentive to do well. But the ways in which anti-imperialist countries are doing it, I mean, there's just it doesn't make sense why they would do it in that way. It's very outdated. And if it's true that they're doing it, all it proves is that they're really bad at cheating. So that's my take on that.
Shall we
It
show?
really stung me when I remember I was really excited by seeing, I think it was Kamila Valieva in the 2022 Olympics. She was capable of doing triple axels, and she had pretty graceful technique and everything. And then I think she got a gold medal, and then it was confiscated from her. They just said, oh, she's cheating. Oh, Russians always cheat.
Yeah, I think that people said that's the only reason Alyssa Liu won gold. Also, it's worth noting her dad was a Soros agent in '89, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
We're
he was
at
a Tiananmen
time.
guy, and he go ahead.
We're at time. I just wanted to do we want to watch Mao with Kim Il Sung and then any comments on that and then the closing video since we're at time?
No, go
I'm
ahead.
not tired.
Okay. All right. So we'll do Mao with Kim Il Sung.
(1970년 10월 8일) 위대한 수령님께서는 베이징에서 숙소를 방문하여 온 모택동 동지와 감격적인 상봉을 하시었습니다. 위대한 수령님께서는 모택동 동지와 역사적인 회담을 하시었습니다. 회담에서는 모든 분야에 걸쳐 날로 좋게 발전하고 있는 두 나라 사이의 전통적인 친선 협조 관계를 더욱 확대 발전시킬 데 대하여 토의했습니다. 이날 모택동 주석은 위대한 수령님을 위하여 만찬을 차렸습니다. 만찬회는 가장 숭고한 혁명적 우애의 정이 뜨겁게 차고 넘치는 속에 진행됐습니다. (10월 10일) 위대한 수령님께서는 인민대회당에서 모택동 동지를 또다시 만나시었습니다. 수령님께서는 모택동 동지와 진지하고 친선적인 분위기 속에서 의의 깊은 회담을 계속하셨습니다. 인류 해방사에서 계급적 형제들 사이의 혁명적 단결에 빛나는 모범을 마련하신 위대한 수령님께서와 모택동 동지는 회담에서 토의된 모든 문제들에서 완전한 견해의 일치를 보셨습니다. 회담 후 모택동 동지는 수령님을 정중히 배웅해 드렸습니다. 경의하는 수령님께서는 숙소를 방문하여 온 주얼레 동지와 만나시었습니다. 위대한 수령님께서는 주얼레 동지와 회담하시었습니다. 동지적이며 두터운 신뢰의 정이 넘치는 속에 진행된 회담에서는 두 당과 두 나라 인민들 사이의 전통적인 친선 협조 관계를 더욱 발전시킬 데 대하여서와 호상 관심사로 되는 문제들이 토의됐습니다. 위대한 수령님의 중국 방문을 환영하여 중국 공산당 중앙연회 정치국에서는 성대한 요원회를 차렸습니다. 연회에 참석하신 위대한 수령님께서는 주울레 동지와 친선적인 담화를 하시었습니다.
Reactions?
I love the smile. It was contagious.
Yeah?
Yeah, Kim Il-sung has a great smile. He does. He's so happy to meet Mao. It's funny, they're contemporaries, but it's like Mao's 20 years older than him, so he's like the great communist leader. You see him like shake his hand over and over again. It's like a kid in a candy store or something, you know?
Yeah.
But yeah, I think we can play our final clip, and then we can end. Just a reminder, everybody, that if you enjoyed tonight's stream, if you enjoyed the study tonight, if you could please just donate $5 or whatever you can to just make sure that we can continue to do these. And hope everybody has a great night.
Yeah.
Should I sing a song or juggle? There we go.
A weak nation can defeat a strong. A small nation can defeat a big. This is a law of history. It's a law of history.
Globalism, imperialism, as I understand it from CPI, is a financial system that is run by Wall Street and London, where giant international corporations spread their tentacles around the world, holding back development.
You look around this country, they are literally unpaving the roads in 27 different states. Municipalities cannot maintain paved roads. They don't have enough money. They're unpaving roads all across America. Our life expectancy has gone down by 2 years. Is Iran the one doing this to us? No. This is being done by big corporations, vultures, bankers that are looting the public budget to serve an international system.
How I define globalism/imperialism is the growth while the private banks and private corporation grows and scams the regular working person in America. And is modern time colonialism.
Globalists, elite, oligarchs, corporatists, the deep state. I mean, it's all that same class of people that are at the top, and they want to stay at the top.
They sink their fangs into Africa, they sink their fangs into Latin America, they sink their fangs into Asia, and they have U.S. military bases to accompany the corporations to extract huge profits from across the planet, while we, the American people, the American working class, American working families are left behind.
Not only are they doing something that's immoral by conquering other countries, but they're also doing it in a way that does not benefit the working people of the core empire. It only benefits this global ruling class that has hollowed out industries and has financialized everything.
You know, Nigeria is a country in Africa with so much oil, but the people of Nigeria are in deep and utter poverty because their oil is controlled by ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron, and they are prevented from building up their own economy. And there are many examples of this, and that imperialism is going around the world in degrowing countries.
Our servicemen do not want to fight. On the aircraft carriers that they have parked outside of Iran, you have thousands of American servicemen intentionally clogging the toilets and trying to flood the aircraft carrier because They know that the Iranian people are not their enemy.
And the countries that have broken free from that system, like Burkina Faso, where they are creating food sovereignty and economic independence, get demonized as juntas and authoritarian.
Iran is not the enemy, folks. Israel's the enemy. The Zionists are the enemy. Epstein elitists are the enemy.
Their system is more destructive than productive.
I really appreciate the Center for Political Innovation because we are a family. We understand that we have to encourage each other and that to stay on the revolutionary road, we also need to work on personal development.
Lenny Bruce, the comedian, he had a joke that he told that went like this. I don't know if you've ever heard it. He used to talk about the old 1950s television show. It's The Lone Ranger. You know, the Lone Ranger, he wore a mask. He was a white dude. And then he had a Native American sidekick named Tonto. The story goes, the joke of Lenny Bruce is that the Lone Ranger and Tonto were surrounded by a group of Native Americans with their spears ready, pointed out at them, and they were facing the edge of a cliff. There was no escape. And so the Lone Ranger turned to Tonto and said, "Tonto, what are we going to do?" And Tonto said, "What do you mean we, white man?" Well, you think about that joke, I think that's what's ahead for the U.S. ruling class. Because they're looking at China rising up, and they're looking at Russia rising up, and they're looking at Venezuela and Iran, and they're turning to the American working class, and they're saying, "American working class." And I think Joe Biden's saying, "American working class, what are we going to do?" And the American working class is saying, "What do you mean we, Joe Biden? What do you mean we?"
An author of a brand new book called Imperialism and Anti-Imperialism. And when I first started flipping through this book, what struck me wasn't necessarily that I agreed with everything in it. In fact, there's plenty of things here that I think people are going to want to challenge. But what I found interesting is that Caleb is trying to answer some really big questions that a lot of us have been wrestling with lately. And what makes the book interesting is that it's not just a collection of Caleb's thoughts on world events. Much of it is drawn from his own experiences over the years, covering international politics, organizing anti-war movements, traveling abroad, questioning U.S. government officials, speaking in countries like Iran, interacting with world leaders, including Vladimir Putin, and even having one of his articles republished in North Korea's state newspaper. Through those experiences, Caleb explores some of the biggest geopolitical questions of our time, from China and Russia to Ukraine, NATO, energy markets, sanctions, and the shifting balance of power in an increasingly multipolar world. And whether you agree with his conclusions or not, he has a very different framework for understanding what's happening in the world right now than what we hear on CNN, Fox News, or most of the mainstream press.
이
Thanks everyone for watching. Have a good night.